Chapter 1: The Silent Awakening. Welcome to Synapse Daily. Today, we revisit the year 1975. The world felt a strange, cold pulse. It came from deep within the USSR. Massive steel structures rose from the Taiga. They were not buildings for people. They were eyes for a dying empire. Imagine a wall of pure energy. It scanned the edge of space. The Soviets were terrified of a strike. They needed to see the missiles early. 1975 marked the dawn of total surveillance. It was the phased array radar expansion. A secret network covering thousands of miles. The sky was no longer a mystery. It was a digital battlefield. Could anyone truly hide from this? The answers lie in the concrete ruins. Let us peel back the Iron Curtain. The Soviet airwaves were thick with signals. Engineers worked in total, absolute secrecy. They built foundations on frozen ground. The earth trembled under the massive weight. These radars were built to last centuries. Every bolt had a strategic purpose. Every wire carried a heavy burden. The Kremlin watched the western horizon. They feared the silent rain of fire. Nuclear war was a daily thought. The early warning system was their shield. It was a race against the clock. The Americans were advancing their own tech. Moscow could not afford to fall behind. So, they poured billions into the ground. They built cities just for these machines. Science was the only path to survival. Technology became the new frontline. This was the invisible curtain of 1975. It watched every bird in every plane. Nothing could move without being noticed. The silent awakening had finally begun. Now, the giants were truly alive. Their heartbeats were pulses of radiation. Their vision reached beyond the stars. Welcome to the age of early warning. Chapter 2: The Steel Giants. How big is a radar face? Picture a building 20 stories high. Now, make it entirely of sensors. This was the Dnestrem system. NATO called them the henhouse. They were monsters made of gray concrete. One stood at the edge of Latvia. Another watched from the Kola Peninsula. They didn't rotate like old radars. Phased arrays use electronic beam steering. The beam moves at light speed. No mechanical parts to slow it down. This technology changed the game forever. In 1975, these giants started multiplying. The Kremlin demanded a total perimeter. Every angle of approach was covered. From the Arctic to the Caspian Sea. The USSR was building an electronic cage. It was a marvel of Soviet engineering. But it came with a heavy price. Thousands of tons of specialized steel. Cooling systems that never stopped humming. The heat from the transmitters was intense. It could melt snow for miles around. The power lines were thick and dangerous. Local legends spoke of strange glowing lights. But the truth was much more clinical. It was physics used as a weapon. The radar faces were perfectly flat. They looked like mirrors for a giant. But they only reflected radio waves. Each module was a masterpiece of design. If one failed, 1,000 others worked. They were redundant and extremely resilient. The Soviet spirit was built into them. Hard, cold, and incredibly powerful. They stood as silent sentinels of war. No one dared to approach their fences. The steel giants never closed their eyes. They waited for a signal from space. Chapter 3: The 1975 Pivot. Why did 1975 matter so much? The ABM Treaty was already signed. The US and USSR had limits. But radars were the ultimate gray area. You can't fight without seeing first. The Soviets realized their old tech failed. Old radars were easily blinded by nukes. They needed something faster and smarter. 1975 saw the birth of the Daryl. This was the next generation of power. The Pechora site began its long journey. It was a bistatic radar system. One building transmits, the other receives. They were separated by nearly a kilometer. The scale was simply beyond belief. Washington started to get very nervous. Was this for defense or attack? The line was becoming very thin. The expansion moved at a frantic pace. New locations were mapped in 1975. Logistics were planned with military precision. The Soviet leadership was very desperate. They saw the US Minuteman missiles. They saw the rising power of satellites. The old Dnestr units were not enough. The 1975 pivot was a strategic choice. It shifted the focus to total detection. If a missile launched, they knew instantly. Heat signatures were tracked with high detail. The computers began to take control. Algorithms replaced human eyes in the loop. This was a dangerous, new era. One glitch could end the entire world. Yet, the construction continued in silence. The budget for the project was infinite. Nothing was too expensive for the motherland. 1975 was the year of no return. The electronic wall was growing fast. It defined the rest of the decade. Chapter 4: The Physics of Fear. How does a phased array work? Think of thousands of tiny antennas. Each one sends a small signal. By timing them, they create a beam. This beam can jump across the sky. It happens in a fraction of a second. In 1975, this was peak science. It required massive computing power. The Soviets used the M10 computer. It was a beast of its time, processing millions of operations every second. They had to filter out birds. They had to ignore northern lights. The goal was a single nuclear warhead, detected while it's still in space. Give Moscow 20 minutes to react. Those minutes were the difference between life and total, absolute global annihilation. This was the physics of pure fear. The waves traveled at the speed of light. They hit a target and bounced back. The return signal was incredibly weak. But the massive receivers caught it all. They filtered the noise from the void. Science became a tool for survival. The math behind the beams was complex. It required the best Soviet minds. Physics professors became secret military assets. They worked in hidden underground labs. They calculated wave interference for years. Every degree of the beam mattered. A small error meant a missed missile. The pressure on the scientists was crushing. Success meant life for the nation. Failure meant a rain of atomic ash. The physics were solid and very real. The fear was even more real. 1975 was a year of high stakes. The atmosphere was alive with hidden energy. Chapter 5: The Pechora Monster. Let's look at the Pechora site. Deep in the Komi Republic. The landscape is flat and frozen. Suddenly, a massive structure appears. It looks like a futuristic pyramid. The receiver face is a giant square. 80 meters by 80 meters of metal. It looks like an alien artifact. This was the heart of the expansion. Construction was a logistical nightmare. Thousands of workers moved into the wild. They worked in sub-zero temperatures. The radar needed its own power plant. It consumed as much as a city. All of this for an invisible beam. Pechora was the ultimate watchtower. It looked toward the North Pole. That was where the missiles would come. The foundations were set in deep permafrost. Special cooling pipes kept the ground frozen. If the ground melted, the radar tilted. Precision was required to the millimeter. The walls were thick, reinforced concrete. They could survive a near-nuclear hit. Inside, miles of copper cables hummed. The air smelled of ozone and oil. Soldiers guarded the perimeter with dogs. No civilian ever saw this monster close. It was a secret etched in stone. 1975 made this nightmare a reality. The Pechora Monster began its long watch. It scanned the silent, empty Arctic sky, waiting for a ghost that never came. It was the pride of Soviet defense. A brutal monument to the Cold War. Chapter 6, NATO's Nightmare. Satellite photos arrived at the CIA. The analysts couldn't believe their eyes. The structures were getting bigger. NATO gave them strange, bird-like names. Henhouse, doghouse, cathouse. But the threat was not funny. These radars could track multiple targets. They could distinguish decoys from warheads. This threatened the balance of power. If the USSR could stop a strike, they might be tempted to start one. The 1975 expansion triggered new tensions. The Americans responded with pave-paws. The radar race was officially on. Invisible waves were fighting for dominance. The atmosphere was thick with electronic noise. Peace was kept by mutual fear. NATO commanders studied the new footprints. They looked for gaps in the coverage. But the Soviets were closing every hole. The 1975 expansion was a total net. It created a wall of detection. Western pilots felt the electronic pulse. Their sensors screamed in the high cockpit. The henhouse was always watching them. It was a psychological war of nerves. Who had the better signal processing? Who could jam the other first? Every year, the power levels increased. The nightmare grew larger and louder. The world was caught in the middle. Two giants staring through electronic eyes. Chapter 7, The Secret Locations. Where do you hide a mountain? The Soviets chose the most remote edges. Skrunda in Latvia watched the west. Olenogorsk watched the freezing north. Balkash guarded the southern skies. Mysilevka kept an eye on China. Each site was a closed military city. They didn't exist on civilian maps. Families lived in the shadow of waves. Children played near high-voltage fences. They knew their fathers protected the motherland. But they never knew the full truth. The radiation was a constant, silent concern. The power output was truly staggering. These were the loneliest outposts on Earth, guarding against a war that never came. Supplies arrived by secret military trains. The mail was censored by the KGB. Life was quiet in these radar towns. But the technology was incredibly loud. Giant fans cooled the transmitter halls. The sound was a low, constant drone. It became the heartbeat of the residents. They lived in 1975's most secret spots. Vast forests hid the massive cooling towers. From above, they looked like industrial scars. On the ground, they felt like fortresses. Each location was a piece of history. A dot on a map only leaders saw. Chapter 8, The Computing Crisis. The hardware was always the bottleneck. Soviet chips lagged behind the West. But their math was world-class. Engineers wrote brilliant, efficient code. They squeezed every bit from the machines. In 1975, the algorithms were refined. How do you track 20 fast objects? How do you ignore a solar flare? The software was the real secret weapon. It was all written in assembly language, hard-coded into the very iron of the system. One mistake could trigger World War III. The operators lived under immense pressure. False alarms were a constant threat. The machine was only half the story. The human element was the real shield. The M10 computers filled entire rooms. They used huge amounts of electricity. Memory was measured in small kilobytes. Yet, they solved complex orbital equations. They predicted impact points in seconds. The code was a work of art. It had to be perfect every time. There was no room for a reboot. The survival of millions was the goal. Soviet programmers were the silent heroes. They fought a war of pure logic. In 1975, logic was the only defense. The crisis was real and very near. Chapter 9: The Violation Controversy. Later, one site caused a global crisis. The Krasnoyarsk radar at Yeniseisk. The US claimed it violated the treaty. It was too far inland. Treaty said radars must face outward. Krasnoyarsk faced across the Soviet interior. This suggested it was for battle management. It wasn't just an early warning system. The Soviets claimed it tracked space junk. Nobody in Washington believed that story. 1975 set the stage for this lie. It showed the USSR would push limits. Construction continued despite the protests. The billion-ruble structure became a symbol. A symbol of defiance and strategic ambition. Satellite imagery proved the radar was active. It looked toward the American missile fields. The internal placement was a clever trick. It allowed the radar to guide missiles. This was a direct threat to stability. Diplomats argued in rooms filled with smoke. The Soviets held their ground for years. They said it was a scientific endeavor. But the concrete told a different story. It was angled for a nuclear exchange. The 1975 expansion plan was very aggressive. It tested the patience of the West. The world watched this silent chess game. One move could lead to a strike. The radar was a massive, illegal piece. It stood as a monument to deception. Eventually, the truth could not be hidden. But in 1975, the secret was safe. The controversy defined a whole generation. Chapter 10: The Cost of Watching. How much does a radar cost? The expansion drained the Soviet treasury. Billion-ruble investments were common. While people waited in line for bread, the military-industrial complex was hungry. It demanded the best materials. It took the best young minds. 1975 was a year of economic strain. But the Kremlin never blinked. Security was more important than comfort. The radar network was a sacred project. It was the insurance policy for communism. Without it, they were blind. With it, they were a superpower. The concrete was mixed with sacrifice. The steel was forged in national pride. Think of the sheer volume of copper. Miles of wiring for every single panel. The electricity used was enough for cities. Giant cooling systems ran day and night. Entire factories produced only radar parts. The workers lived in restricted military zones. They received better food than the civilians. But they lived under the KGB's eye. Every ruble spent was a ruble lost. Lost from schools, hospitals, and basic needs. The 1975 expansion was a heavy burden. It was the price of staying relevant. The Soviets built a wall of gold. But it was gold painted in gray. The cost was measured in human potential. The empire was buying time with debt. Chapter 11: The Invisible Battlefield. The air was full of megatons. Not of TNT, but of radio waves. These radars operated in the VHF band. They bounced signals off the ionosphere. The interference was sometimes heard on radios. The Russian woodpecker was a different system. But the phased arrays were just as loud. They were electronic lighthouses in the dark. U.S. signals intelligence ships listened closely. They tried to fingerprint every radar. They wanted to know the exact frequencies. Electronic warfare became a high-stakes game. Could the U.S. jam these giants? Could the Soviets burn through the jamming? The 1975 expansion was a silent roar. High-altitude spy planes gathered the pulses. They flew close to the Soviet borders. The radar beams would lock onto them. It was a dance on the edge. Specialists analyzed the pulse repetition frequency. Every signal had a unique electronic signature. The airwaves were a crowded, messy place. Soviet operators tried to hide their patterns. They changed frequencies at random intervals. It was a game of cat and mouse. The battlefield was made of invisible light. No blood was spilled in this war. But the tension was incredibly high. 1975 was the peak of this static. The world was humming with secret data. Chapter 12, The Legacy of 1975. Most of these sites are gone now. Skrunda was blown up in Latvia. Others sit as rusting, hollow shells. But the tech lives on today. Modern Voronezh radars use the same principles. They are just smaller and more efficient. 1975 was the rough, brutal prototype. It proved that phased arrays were king. The network prevented a surprise attack. It kept the balance of terror stable. We are here because these radars worked. They watched the sky so we didn't. History is written in concrete and waves. The expansion was a masterpiece of fear. Think of the ruins in the forest. Trees now grow through the transmitter halls. The giant antennas are home to birds. But the shadow of 1975 remains. It taught us about the power of vision. It showed how far empires go for security. The electronic wall is a ghost now. Yet, its lessons are still very loud. We still live in a watched world. The eyes just moved to higher orbits. The legacy is one of survival. A story of science meeting deep paranoia. The 1975 expansion changed the world. It kept the fire from falling down. Chapter 13, Closing the Curtain. Thank you for joining Synapse Daily. The Soviet radar expansion remains a legend. A story of 1975 and beyond. Huge buildings, invisible beams, and secrets. It was the peak of the Cold War. The world stayed safe by watching closely. Next time, we dive into satellite wars. Until then, keep your eyes on the horizon. The sky is never truly empty. Check our show notes for technical details. Follow us for more hidden history. This is Synapse Daily signing off. Stay curious. Stay informed. Goodbye for now.